The next session, International Finance, will the U.S. maintain the dollar dominance in the age of great power competition? And I'm pleased to introduce the moderator for that next session, my colleague here at Stanford and a senior fellow at CEPR, Darrell Duffy. Darrell is the Adams Distinguished Professor of Management and Professor of Finance at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and a professor by courtesy in the Department of Economics. He's been on the finance faculty at Stanford since receiving his PhD from Stanford in 1984. He is a senior fellow of CEPR, research fellow of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Darrell is a past president of the American Finance Association and chaired the Financial Stability Board's Market Participants Group on Reference Rate Reform. He is an independent director of the Dimensional Funds and a member of the leadership team of the G30 Working Group on Treasury Market Liquidity. Darrell's most recent book is Fragmenting Markets, Post-Crisis Bank Regulations and Financial Market Liquidity. I could, once again, talk a lot about his many accomplishments and publications over the years, but I'm going to stop there and turn it over now to Darrell.
Will the United States maintain dollar dominance? Well, Maury has already let the cat out of the bag, and having taken a poll of our panelists, I think that's not the issue for today. It's taken for granted. The question is, what are the implications? How will the United States maintain it? Will it erode? Will it be magnified by U.S. policy? What are the impacts of that on the rest of the world? How does it benefit the United States? And so on. So those are the main issues that we're going to discuss today. Robert Mundell, the famous Canadian Nobel Prize-winning economist, said, "Great powers have great currencies." So this panel are the subject matter experts on this issue, as you will discover in the next few minutes. So let me introduce them in the order in which I would like them to give you all some prepared remarks. I told them each 8 to 9 minutes. That's very precise, so that we safeguard the time for all of you to ask them questions, because this is a topic on which it seems many, many people have strong opinions. That is the issue of dollar dominance. So our first speaker will be Michael Falkender, the Dean's Professor of Finance at the University of Maryland. Recently, in fact, during the period of COVID, when COVID hit, Michael was the Assistant Treasury Secretary who was charged with the implementation of PPP, among many other responsibilities. So if you didn't get your check, you can try to catch Michael at the door on the way out. Michael has also been working on dollar dominance. He's a deep expert on this topic. In fact, he was asked to testify in the United States Congress on exactly that issue, dollar dominance. Our second speaker for today is my esteemed close colleague here at the Graduate School of Business, Professor Matteo Maggiore. He is the Moghadam Family Professor of Finance at the Graduate School of Business. He is a noted expert on dollar dominance. His research area is international macro. He's also the co-founder of the Global Capital Allocation Project, which is a huge project designed to map capital flows and financial flows across countries around the world. And Matteo has quite a distinguished record of accomplishments, which has been recognized with prizes that basically cover at least the Western world for the leading financial economists. So as far as the United States, he has won the Fisher-Black Prize. In the domain of Italy, which is his former home, he has the Carlo Alberto Medal, and he also holds the Bernays Prize. Now, these must be awarded to an economist under 40, like the John Bates Clark Medal. So this is kind of indicating that Matteo has scooped up all the prizes there are to be had for under 40. There's only those for the post-40 set that are left for him. And our third speaker is Professor Carla Norliff, who is in the political science department at the University of Toronto. So she's a fellow Canadian like myself. She's a senior fellow also at the Atlantic Council. And her research focuses specifically on the great powers, and in particular, the implications of great power in the area of money, trade, and security. A little inside story, I was trying to learn more about dollar dominance several years ago, and I asked Sir Paul Tucker, who's a kind of leading expert on central banking, what should I read? And he said, have you read Carla Norliffe? And I said, uh-oh. So then I went and I read her work, and I think you all should do the same if you're interested in this topic. She's written for, of course, many academic publications, but she's also reaching a wider audience, for example, in The Guardian, in The Washington Post, and I particularly recommend her essay on today's topic in Foreign Affairs. So with that, if I could ask Michael to come in and tee this off, framing the topic, and then we'll have Matteo and then Carla. We have slides?
Yes, they're up. Great. Well, let me take this opportunity to thank Daryl and to thank the organizers for having me. As he mentioned, I held the role as Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy during the Trump administration. And so, yes, among other things, I was responsible for PPP. But one of the other, prior to the pandemic hitting, my team and I were responsible for this topic, among others. And I said to my team at the time, the Treasury Secretary will always go out to the public and to the world and say the dollar will never not be the world's reserve currency, and our job is to make that a true statement. So let me talk you, the way that I've got this talk structured is, for those of you that are not familiar with this topic, let's just talk generically about the role of money. I would then want to show you, just set some facts for you, according to the Federal Reserve, about dollar dominance. Talk a little bit about the challenges. Some of them are going to be taken on by my fellow panelists, and then just very quickly give you my outlook. So there are three roles of money, right? The first is to facilitate exchange. The second is a store of value, and the third is as a unit of measure. So if we're going to facilitate trade just within a country or even across countries, there needs to be some common asset that we're going to exchange. And so it requires certain characteristics like being widely accepted, ease of transfer, the divisibility, and that it's fraud resistant. To be a store of value, it needs to retain value not only today, but also in future periods, because we don't have perfect matching between when we generate income and when we consume that income. And then finally, as a unit of measure, in order to facilitate investments as well as tax structures, we need some kind of common measurement in order to establish those kinds of activities. And so what we want to do is think about the dollar vis-a-vis alternative choices that the world could have in meeting these different components. And I want to focus primarily on the first two, which are means of exchange and store of value. But before I do that, there's some great data on the Fed's website, so let me walk you through what it looks like. When we say that the dollar is dominant, what we mean is that while the U.S.'s global economic activity is 20% of world GDP, dollars represent about 60% of foreign reserves. And so it's well overrepresented on foreign bank balance sheets. And when you look at that over time, there's a small reduction in the scale of the portion of world reserve assets that are held in dollars, but it's been very minimal. It's held pretty steady over time. Next is going to come in Europe, with very little coming from the British pound, the yen, or the Chinese RMB. If you say, one of the primary reasons for that is because the US dollar is also overrepresented in the portion of international trade invoiced in dollars. And so while international trade has only about 10% of it involving a US counterparty, about 60% of it is 50 to 60% is invoiced in dollars. And so even though you have non-US trading partners engaged in these exchanges, they are still invoicing in dollars rather than in one of the two home currencies or somebody else. Now, obviously in Europe, it's primarily done in euros, but if you look at Africa and Asia, as well as the Americas, it's largely done in dollars. If you then go look at bank balance sheets, whether we look at claims that they have or if you look at the deposits that they've got, again, to the extent that there are foreign holdings or foreign claims that are sitting on bank balance sheets, they're almost overwhelmingly, certainly a great majority of them are in dollars. And then, as I said, if you look at the liabilities of the banks, they're also likewise denominated in dollars. And so when we talk about dollar dominance, it's that on all of these different dimensions, reserve holdings, invoicing, et cetera, a lot of this is going on in dollars. And it's been relatively flat over time. Okay, and so then finally, if you look at foreign exchange, whenever you've got an exchange from one currency into another, remember that this is going to add up to 200% because you have two currencies in every one of these transactions. And so the US dollar is on one side of those transactions about 75 to 80% of the time, right? And so then it's other currencies that we're engaging with on those. So the dollar plays a very dominant role and has done so over a long time period. Okay, so what are the challenges as I see them? Well, the one that we talked about most at Treasury is that in a time of changing technology, is the US keeping updated on both the technology and the regulatory environment governing exchange? All right, and so we know that the Chinese have in many ways advanced their financial technology investments and their payment systems in ways that some would think that are surpassing the United States. And so as we think about blockchain technology, as we think about cryptocurrencies, these very well likely will reduce transaction costs and the speed with which these transactions are facilitated. And so are we creating a regulatory sandbox where firms can simultaneously realize the innovation that's necessary to reduce cost and reduce time, but at the same time maintain the security checks that we have in place? And so, one of the things that I liked about what the Biden administration did is that they put Treasury at the center of balancing the needs of improving the technology with the national security pieces, because both of those are housed within the Treasury Department. All right, but that's going to require that we update things like SWIFT, like Fedwire, the systems that we underpin foreign remittances in. Now, there are some places where we've got some problems here, but as Maury already talked about in his remarks at lunch, there are some of our foreign competitors that likewise have those difficulties. So we do need to update both SEC and CFTC jurisdictions. The two of them are fighting right now over how much of this, what's going on in the crypto space is commodities versus versus securities. And so we do need to update. Congress does need to work on a bipartisan fashion to work that out. But of course, one of the things that maintains the dollar vis-a-vis, say, the RMB is that you have capital controls primarily exiting China. That's going to never create a situation where foreign reserve banks are going to want to hold lots of Chinese-denominated securities, because right when they're going to need to transact in them in order to facilitate exchange, they are not going to be able to engage in those conversions. Now, there are some proposals out there to create, for instance, asset-backed currencies. I'm very skeptical that those are actually going to be much of a threat, and here's why. In order for them to facilitate the role that the dollar plays, such that people would want to have, say, petro-linked currencies available to them, you have to have a counterparty that everybody trusts will not suspend conversion. And I don't think that there's a single player out there that, if we were to have some kind of geopolitical strife, will continue to convert whatever currency they offer into petroleum or whatever alternative asset there is. And so lacking that, I'm not really worried about the BRICS discussions of a petrodollar or some kind of currency like that. Okay, the other thing, of course, that's challenging us is, as a store of value, is the unsustainable fiscal situation that we have here in the United States. Again, Maury kind of took my thunder out of that. I'm hesitant a little bit because it's not as if the administration I served was a fantastic fiscal steward on this. I do say my first week accomplishment was that I got the financial report of the government to no longer call Section 2 of the report where we're going. It's now called an unsustainable fiscal path. And I'm glad the Biden-Harris administration has continued with the title of that second paragraph. But again, we have gone from about structural 3.5% of GDP deficits to 6%. The baby boomers are in the midst, the largest years of the baby boom are in the midst of retiring right now, and so that's only going to continue to grow. So very quickly, my outlook. There are also a lot of foreign policy issues that I'm largely going to cede to Carla to set those up for you, and then we'll have discussions about those later. But as Maury commented, it's not as if we can just say, okay, the US has got problems, therefore it's going to lose its position. You've got to go to something else. And so when you look at the alternatives out there, it's not as if they're facing a situation that's all of that better than the one that we're in. So I already talked about the problems with China. Europe has just as many demographic and fiscal issues that we've got, and they have not succeeded with the creation of the euro to create that viable substitute. The markets in Japan and the UK are just too small to serve the world's needs. And again, BRICS is largely talking about an asset-backed security that I don't think is particularly viable. So I guess my bottom line, as Daryl implied in the introduction, we've got problems, but so does everybody else. And for that reason, our situation's probably going to endure. I still think that this is an opportunity for us to call on policymakers to address some of these issues, improving the technology, making sure that we've got a regulatory environment that facilitates dollar dominance, and that we address our fiscal stewardship as well as the foreign policy issues. And with that, I think Carla's up next to tee those up. Oh, sorry, Matteo. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see if they have my slides. Do you have my slides? Fantastic. Okay. So thank you for having me. So first, I want to put some facts out there that then we can discuss in the Q&A, and then hopefully just to make it a little bit more interesting than the obvious forecast that next year we're still going to be on the dollar. We can think about what being on the dollar means, what it does, what are the policy constraints, what is it good for and not good for. But if you want to get a quick sense of how exceptional being on the dollar is, I think Treasury is normally what we focus on, mostly because that's where we have data. But in recent years, we started to focus much more on the private sector. So these are corporate bonds, and the bars on the left simply remind you that every country has corporates that borrow from its own domestic investors in its own currency, at least every advanced country. The shallow bars, the hollow bars on the other side, tell you what the foreigners do in those same countries. And there you really see the exception. When the US buys corporate bonds in Western Europe, 85% of those are actually in dollars. When Europe buys corporate bonds in the US, 95% or so are in dollars. And the US is a huge exception. In fact, it's the only country that looks like our textbooks as far as the private market is concerned. So when you think about the importance of this, it goes well beyond the rates at which the federal government borrows. It goes into the entire corporate sector, particularly the non-financial sector, which I think we largely overlooked for a lack of data. Similarly, when you look away from the reserves data, I don't love the reserves data, and if somebody pushes me, I'll tell you why. But I like data that I understand better, and this one is the data for the private sector, so mutual funds and ETFs, cross-border, what do they hold? And when you look at the time series, clearly the dollar is not going anywhere. In fact, if anything, has become even more important since the global financial crisis. And part of that is issuance, but part of that is the cross-border portfolio selection is switching more and more into dollars. So I see no patterns that the dollar is going away in the data anytime soon. And yet, as other speakers pointed out, when you look at the debt, particularly the federal debt, it's not looking rosy. I mean, in fact, I wrote a paper with the late Emmanuel Fari in 2018, and there was quite a prominent journalist that we spoke to, and she thought we were crazy because back in 2017, we were thinking about situations where the US debt might be so big that if the rest of the world wants to stop financing you, interest rates shoot up, and you have a problem. Now, a few years later, we're still nowhere near that. But all of a sudden, the statement doesn't look so crazy. It's in the newspapers all the time. What has happened is, in the meantime, two things have happened. One is debt to GDP has gone up even more. Two, interest rates are no longer at zero. They're starting to go up. And so until recently, we were used to the idea that despite the fact that the debt has skyrocketed, interest rates had fallen so much that the cost of servicing the debt was falling. Now, fortunately, I wasn't among the economists that thought that that was a license for borrowing forever and ever. I thought, God knows, I mean, I'm a financial economist. I'm pretty well trained in financial econometrics. If you ask me what my prediction is for future interest rates, I just don't know. And so if I don't know, I need to think about risk management. What happens if interest rates are low forever, and what happens if interest rates are very high at some point? And if you take that risk management view, you start thinking about something that actually Maury put on the table years back on a modern version of the Triffin dilemma. The idea that you could be in a situation where interest rates are low, the world is trusting you, and if you don't expand the debt, you get towards the zero lower bound. We're familiar with that world. We've been in it for a while. On the other hand, if you expand it too much, your fiscal commitment might come to bite. And you might find yourself into a situation where servicing the debt gets more and more expensive and where you might have a run on the dollar. Now, if that sounds crazy to you, at some level it is, because we're nowhere near that. But when you look at the long arc of history, if you're a reserve currency and you take for granted that you'll be a reserve currency forever, you have no empirical support for that statement. Reserve currencies and monetary systems come and go. In fact, we seem to set them up at some posh seaside conference. They work for a while until they don't. And Bretton Woods, which Murray mentioned were in the 50th anniversary, was one of those. It was ultimately unsustainable, and the Nixon administration, faced with more and more claims coming out of Europe on the US, decided to depreciate the dollar massively. The Brits had done it before them at the end of the gold exchange standard, which was roughly speaking a similar arrangement in the 20s. The UK had a pretty stellar reputation as a borrower. I would argue stronger than the one that the US enjoys today. And nonetheless, when push comes to shove, they depreciated the pound 30%. The Banque de France, that was the largest creditor, was the equivalent to China today, was effectively bankrupt because of the British depreciation. So when you look over a long history, you should both be reassured that forecasting that we're still going to be on the dollar tomorrow, it's a safe bet, because this process is extremely persistent. But you should not mistake that one for, and nothing we ever do is going to change this, or that this lasts forever in some automatic sense. In fact, it doesn't. And I'm Italian. Florence, last time we were relevant was the Renaissance. But at that time, we were very relevant, and the Medici had the international currency. So things do change. Now, when you look at China coming up, it's kind of a very interesting case, because it's easy to dismiss it for the wrong reasons either way. So first, how many of you know that China is the second or third largest bond market in the world? Now, I'm pretty good at this stuff, and I didn't know until 5 years ago. I kind of lost track. The reason is it's changed so rapidly. So this is a very large, actually fairly liquid market, but the foreigners until recently were totally shut off. They've done pretty large reforms, letting the foreigners come in. The foreigners came in a little bit. I'll show you the data. They were holding at some point 3 or 4% of the bond market. That's higher. They were very concentrated in the government, so that's about 10% of the government securities. But recently, they've been pulling out. Now, if you think about China, China is a country at the very, very beginning of the process of being an international currency. It has some good things with it. Clearly, it's very large. It's geopolitically powerful. It's a big trading partner. But every country wants to convince you that they're going to be a reserve currency because them and their firms get to borrow cheap. But unless you can trust that you're going to get your money back, it's very difficult to be a reserve currency. And the problem is that in equilibrium, once the people that gave you the money want it back, you're going to be very tempted not to give it back. And governments do all sorts of tricks not to give it back. In China's case, capital controls is one, but you can depreciate, you can put some form of pressure. There's lots of ways to slow down a capital flight, but it's expensive. Think about the US. Other than if you're invading Ukraine, we tend to say that whether we like you or not, you can access the treasury market and you can take the money out on any given day without us interfering. That's a very strong promise and one that is very difficult to keep. So building that kind of reputation is extremely difficult, and you can get stuck into a trap where you have low reputation, so imposing capital controls doesn't lose you much reputation because everybody was expecting it, and you never get out of it. So if you look at the data for China, and actually last night I updated this, but I wasn't confident enough that my update was correct, despite the fact that one of my students felt it was correct. But if you look at the new bar, so China has been receiving more and more foreign capital, but recently it's coming down. If I added a year of data, we would be down here. So the foreigners have been pulling money out, and unsurprisingly, it's the private sector that is pulling out faster. They're much flighter. And so China is experiencing what every emerging market experiences. Capital comes in, and then it comes out very fast. And so far, they haven't shut the gate. But it's not looking pretty either. There's lots of questions on whether this market is viable for the foreigners. I'm going to skip this one because I'm roughly speaking at time. But I will just mention that one dimension where China has become very big is on the offshore market. So Maury has mentioned places like Luxembourg or the Cayman Islands. There, again, you might not have noticed this, but China is now the dominant player. So when you mention offshore, people think about Apple or the American companies tax inverting into Ireland. That's all true, but in terms of value, it's the Chinese companies in the Cayman Islands that dominate the data by any stretch of the imagination. They went from being a tiny fraction of world equity in these financial centers to being 60% of all value. And that has changed pretty quickly. So onshore and offshore for China mean very different things to foreign investors, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Warm thanks to Daryl Duffy, to Julia, and to Julia and Aline for welcoming me here to Stanford's Business School. It's a great pleasure to be here. I am going to just do one slide in opposition to my colleagues here, but I think that it is quite a revelatory slide. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. People tend to have a passionate relationship to the dollar, and that is because it is so much more than a means of payment. It's not just an economic instrument. It is also a tool of coercion. It's an ordering mechanism. It's a tool for order enforcement, and we're seeing more of this today. For the entire post-war era, as people have pointed out here, the dollar has been at the top of the currency hierarchy, and it is likely to persist at the top of the hierarchy. Now, dominance does tend to inspire awe, but it also invites loathing and therefore prompts challenges. And we're seeing some of those challenges come home to roost today. It's extremely difficult, however, to dislodge such a dominant actor because there are incentives to support the dominant actor either out of gain or for fear of loss. Today's geopolitical environment has certainly resulted in heated debate about the dollar's future and the possibility of a coming multipolar order. I think that when we talk about multipolar currency order, we're very unclear about what it means. I mean, if we're talking about multiple reserve currencies, for instance, that's been the case for the entire post-war era. We've had multiple reserve currencies. And when we think about this from a political science perspective, I mean, there's a very kind of particular definition of polarity. We really are talking about the number of great powers, but that kind of begs the question, what counts as a great power? And so you need to have some kind of cutoff point for who qualifies as a great power. And then we have certain measures that can help us with this. There are certain concentration measures. There are certain other ways in which one can, create yardsticks for thinking about, what counts as a great power. But I've actually measured this, and I'm not showing you the slides. I probably should have, put that slide up as well. But in any conceivable way of thinking about multipolarity or polarity in the currency system, it's very clear that the currency hierarchy is unipolar, right? There were certain attempts, of course, to challenge the dollar, and I think that the most important attempt would come from a geostrategic rival like China, this chart here shows to what extent China really lags behind the United States. So in terms of reserve currency, it accounts for about 3% of reserve currency offerings where the United States is still close to 60%. In terms of international debt security issuance, which was also a metric that my colleagues, both Michael and Matteo, mentioned, again, the China lags far behind. And I will say on this measure, there are different ways that one can, some attentive people in the audience might see that the share here for the United States is different from what the Federal Reserve Board, how they calculate this. I believe that this is a more accurate measure. It's about 40% if we're counting what's issued offshore. If we're counting also what's onshore in the United States, then it's closer to 50%. The Federal Reserve Board actually thinks only about measuring this relative to other foreign currencies, other international currencies. But this is relative to any currency. And this is also the metric that the Bank for International Settlement uses. I want to get back to the geopolitical dimension. We have the US-China rivalry. We have Russia's war on Ukraine. We have the reignited salience of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And what is distinctive about this current moment is the potential of these conflicts to fracture a key element of the post-war economic security bargain. All three conflicts could upend mutually prosperous economic interdependence. And that also runs the risk of bringing in security conflict. Are we going to see new hierarchies as a result of this? The US-China rivalry and Russia's war on Ukraine has already resulted in some decoupling with China and with Russia. Both Russia and China are sanctioned. Palestinian entities affiliated with Hamas are sanctioned. And today there are big concerns that some of these dynamics are playing out in the currency realm as well. Freezing assets and denying access to dollars is said to be creating a backlash against the dollar. And there are other geopolitical factors that could serve as a possible countervailing force. For instance, there's an argument about how US defense commitments and political affinity with the United States actually invites dollar support. So we have basically three geopolitical drivers. US sanctions could trigger blowback against the US dollar. The US security umbrella could invite support for the dollar because countries try to pay the US back in terms of dollar support for what they receive in terms of security support. It is also possible that countries that are closely aligned with the United States also want to support the United States economically. I'm quite skeptical that sanctions actually matter. Unless the United States adopts frequent parochial sanctions, I don't think that sanctions matter for dollar dominance. Defense commitments likely matter less than they did during the Cold War. They could matter more in future, particularly if the geopolitical environment continues to harden. Political affinity has not mattered at all. But again, this could become more important if the trend to privilege economic relations with friends kind of continues, so-called friend shoring, if we saw that also happening in the currency area. But again, if I kind of return to this figure, the entire kind of geopolitics of currency hierarchy debate presupposes that if the dollar is toppled, there's going to be a deliberate strategic attempt, right? There's going to be deliberate actions, and therefore, that's kind of like why it's interesting to see what the United States' nearest geostrategic rival, how they kind of measure up, if we look at kind of the underpinnings of dollar dominance or some features of this, so in terms of the economy, the underlying economy, economic output, GDP, or buying power, we see that China is quite close to the United States, right? But again, this has had very little impact, at least so far, on its ability to provide a comparable currency. If we think that security networks matters, well then China has one security commitment, and that is to North Korea. And the United States has short of 60 security commitments. Okay, thank you very much. I look forward to talking more about this.
Thank you. Well, before we take questions, I want to get a chance to get some more views from the panel, and then we'll open it up. In the interest of time, I want to focus on one set of issues, which is related to Carla's last remarks on, I'll call it economic statecraft, the policy of the United States government vis-a-vis dollar dominance. From what I understand, listening particularly to Michael and Carla, it's kind of a two-way street. You're saying, and also Matteo's comments about the ability of strong dollar or dominant dollar to give U.S. benefits in terms of cheaper borrowing. Also the ability to use the strong dollar to apply sanctions or throw your weight around in terms of statecraft. But then there's the other side of the coin, which is in order to build up a strong dollar, the United States needs to invest, or at least it has had in the past, needed to invest in the power of the dollar. I mean, for example, Bretton Woods, which came up in Maury's remarks, both going in and, as Matteo said, coming out, the secret Saudi deal by which the U.S. offered security in the Middle East in return for the side purchases of treasuries by Saudi Arabia. The telling West Germany central bank, do not sell treasuries, the Carl Blessing affair. These are cases in which the U.S. was working in the other way. It was building the dominance of the dollar. Do any of you see any evidence that the United States is going to reinvest in the dollar dominance, or is it going to exploit dollar dominance and at potentially the expense of dollar dominance going forward?
I will start by saying, building upon some of the remarks that Maury made, and acknowledge that I think the Trump administration erred in creating a vacuum at some of the international multilateral lending groups. I think it's a lesson that we've learned, certainly talking to some of my colleagues who were in the administration, that that just does create a vacuum, that the Chinese are more than happy to fill that void. And so I think that I think the next time that you see a Republican administration, you'll see more seriousness about fully engaging with the IMF and the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks. I think where we'll disagree with the Biden administration is to say that I do not think that pushing renewable energy projects on the developing world and instead pushing them into the hands of the Chinese for lending facilities to invest in fossil fuel-based energy production. I do not think that the developing world is going to allow the continuation of poverty in their nations in order to meet climate goals. And so I do think that you'll see were there to be a Republican administration, I think there would be an effort towards changing some of the lending practices at multilateral institutions so that and that the U.S. would be a primary engaged party in.
Meaning more dollar lending, less renminbi lending.
More dollar lending with broader goals, with broader sets of projects that can be engaged.
Yeah. Carla, any views on whether the U.S. is going to support dollar dominance or just coast on it?
Well, yeah, so I think it really hinges on what it means to support dollar, how that, I think that, U.S. policymakers don't really think about dollar dominance very much because, I think that there's more attention to it now because it's so much in the press, with the Russia sanctions in particular. But if you like, the beauty of the system is that you don't really have to do anything, right? Because it is so dominant that it is self-reinforcing. So at this point, I think that it is more likely to continue to be used as a tool for generating commitment to the liberal international order, right? And I think so in particular because the other way in which order enforcement can take place is extremely unpopular in the United States, right? And so the United States used to uphold the rules-based international order via military enforcement, right? Intervening in countries that were not on board. And that is a much more unpopular and costly way of generating, commitment to the order than through sanctions. And I just want to say also that in my previous remarks, it's not just that I think that sanctions don't matter or that these other geopolitical variables, matter, but perhaps more at the margins. It's really that when you do statistical tests of this, it's not statistically significant, at least not in any robust way.
Good.
Do you mind if I add back? I can also tell you that inside the administration, there were different points of view on the use of sanctions, and certainly from Treasury's point of view, we had concerns about the unilateral sanctions. I think some people called them vanity sanctions. That has the potential. Again, it hasn't yet shown up in the data, right? That it causes a deterioration, but one worries about is there a cascade effect at some point? Do we break the glass at some point? And do we really want to find out where the breaking of the glass moment is? And therefore, we were very reluctant when there was thoughts about doing unilateral sanctions. It's very different, for instance, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a lot of effort to ensure that you had a multilateral coalition that was going to agree to the sanctions. So there is this temptation to abuse the dollar dominance position, and I'd be hesitant to tell policymakers that merely because it's not yet shown up in the data, you could continue to abuse it.
Matteo, any view on this?
Yeah, so what I think we're going to see more investment is in the payment system and in the collection of information. So from a purely fiscal perspective, maintaining the centrality of the dollar, for the US, there is only one thing to do, which is to keep your house in order. Mm-hmm. If you want to compete with China, the best thing is keep offering something safe and liquid. That makes the product attractive. In fact, you might want to over-offer it on the margin to prevent an incumbent from coming in. But really, that's the extent of it. What I think is more interesting is when you look at the payment system, and in particular how we collect information on these payments and the clearing system. That's an aspect that falls from the centrality of the dollar, but if you look at what is being weaponized in geoeconomics, it's really those two aspects. You can force a bank that is not US-based to disclose information by simply threatening them to cut them off from clearing in the US. Whether that's a good idea or not, that's a different story, but you can. In fact, the US did, and HSBC coughed up the information. there, I think you're going to see much more competition. China is, understandably very interested in developing their own payment system. So far, rather unsuccessfully. Now they're finding out that a payment system has complementarities where you need to be able to park your money somewhere in that currency. That was part of the reason why they're opening up their financial markets. It's not that they need to borrow; they're a large creditor to the rest of the world. But there's a simple fact that payments don't cancel out all the time. You need to have a liquid store of value if you want to have a viable payment system. They're much more interested in that than in the simple ability to borrow right now from the foreigners. There, I think we're going to see the U.S. investing, or at least I hope so. The system is rather outdated.
Yes.
Good. Let's try to sit together at dinner so we can engage on this with each other. I want to get the wisdom of the audience, though. So I think this gentleman had his hand up first. If someone would bring him a microphone right up in the front. Yeah. And I'll go to you next, if that's okay. I see several more hands. Just we'll try to get to as many as we can. If you keep your questions very short and questions, that would be helpful.
Thank you. The implicit assumption or some stated claim of everyone here is that dollar dominance is actually good for the U.S. And there certainly is a positive case for it insofar as it increases the international purchasing power of Americans relative to people in the rest of the world, whether that's lower interest rates, higher currency. But the flip side of that seems to be that it also has potential costs, and I think sort of two potential costs here. One is that if your financial system, your capital markets, your banking system are so much larger than your economy, then implicitly the preferences and needs of savers and investors in the rest of the world, borrowers in the rest of the world, are going to have an outsized impact on your own domestic conditions, whether you want it or not. And then related to that is that if your currency is international purchasing power is overvalued relative to what it would be otherwise, it might affect the composition domestically of economic activity. It's effectively going to penalize your domestic manufacturing and tradable sectors relative to everything else. And I think we've seen that in the United States over the past several decades. And I'm wondering, given that, how should policymakers think of, is dollar dominance something actively worth preserving given the costs as well as the benefits?
Matteo's written a lot about this. Matteo, you have a view?
Yeah, so on the first part, I think that's central to the mechanism. Essentially, you're getting low interest rates, but you're committing to let people withdraw capital whenever they want, and you're levering up. This asset is only valuable because you can lever on it. And the better your reputation, the more you extract value by levering on it. The flip side of that is you're going to have, because you have a lot of leverage, you're going to have much bigger crisis exposed. Now, if you put it all together, you're doing the optimal thing, which is doing it a little bit, not as much as you would have done if the crisis weren't coming. So overall, it's net positive, but it's not a simple argument that you borrow cheap and that's the end of it. There are costs that are associated with having such a large financial system and this very flighty capital. You can think of it as we're selling you on-demand deposits, but we're investing in long-term real assets that earn a higher premium. We make money on average, but when the time comes for a bank run, it's expensive. The second argument I'm less persuaded why, not from a qualitative perspective, but from a quantitative perspective, that the costs for an economy of the size of the US are actually that big. There are certainly costs again, but I don't perceive them to be that big. If you're Switzerland, that's a very different story. But for the size of an economy of the US, quantitatively, when you put them together, I haven't seen totally convincing arguments that is that big. The first one, I think we have, at least to my mind, and certainly since I did some of that, I'm biased, but relatively good numbers for this is expensive. But that's what I am.
I just want to add also that I think that some of the costs could be addressed through redistribution and also trade adjustment assistance, retooling methods in order to create greater labor mobility and so forth. And so I know that redistribution is not very enticing for most Americans, but it's one could have a larger pie that then is not so heavily concentrated in certain sectors.
We have a question right here. If someone could bring a microphone to this gentleman.
Oh, thank you. Actually, you answered my question actually a little bit, but I just want to go deeper with the philosophical one. Sometimes I feel having a dominant currency is a curse. Last thing I think about is like Spain. The cost for them to get silver you remember 17th century silver is the predominant currency, right? It's so low. Somehow the curse entire empire go down. So I'm just jokingly, maybe that could something to think about America in much longer terms. Right now it seems 80 years. For another 100 years, could that happen to us?
That's a good comment. Let's take a question. This gentleman right here has been waiting, and then I'll go to the back row, if that's okay.
I know that the rollout of the digital currencies in China didn't quite work out as nicely as they had hoped. But can you comment in general? We don't have a national electronic currency, and was just wondering, do you think that is an issue? Should we be working on rolling out electronic versions of the dollar? And would that help us potentially maintain dominance in the future when digital currencies become popular again?
Did that end up in your portfolio, Michael?
A little bit. I guess the way I think about it is that central bank digital currencies that are institutional CBDCs seem too close to reserves that I don't see what benefit we're realizing from them. If you start going to individuals holding CBDCs, the Treasury Department put out a report on this recently, and I think correctly characterizes the privacy issues as being of significant concern. Right now you have a financial intermediary sitting in between the government and individuals. I think that's a healthy place to be. I think a lot of people on the more libertarian side of things have concerns about that, and I'm hesitant to see what we gain from central bank digital currencies. I think so the advocates generally say that we would get greater participation. We're at 95, 96, 97% population, adult population having access to bank accounts, and I'd much prefer to keep the private sector at the center of financial intermediation for all of the incentive reasons that exist in the private sector.
Can I offer a counterpoint on one,
Go for it.
one aspect of that? I agree with you in terms of cost versus benefit for deploying a digital dollar now. It's too early to tell whether other ways of improving the payment system will emerge. I don't think it's satisfactory right now. I'm not sure a CBDC is right, but bearing in mind that it takes 5 to 10 years to master the technology, including the privacy issues, Europe is planning, it says, in 2 years to come out with one. The United Kingdom now predicts that it will have one by the end of the decade. China has one. Virtually every central bank in the world is doing the R&D for it. Not to have the technology available, it seems to me that the cost that is involved is not, it doesn't seem like the right cost benefit not to at least develop the technology.
I believe FedNow has the capability to expand to do it. They have not deployed it. So I do believe, my understanding is that they are doing the R&D in setting up FedNow that would facilitate it, were that to be determined to actually go ahead and launch it. So
Okay.
they're doing the R&D, I believe.
To
is
be
my
continued.
Yes, at dinner.
Anyone else on this? At dinner, yeah. Dinner's already loading up the agenda.
I just agree with you that I think that it would be counterproductive for the United States not to go wholesale with the CBDC in the current environment, because all advanced economies and many more are actually experimenting with CBDCs, and it does promise faster, easier transactions.
Let's go to the question in the very back row. Yes, thank you. The very back, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the panel. I guess my question is, to what extent does a currency need to be free-floating to be a serious challenger to dollar dominance? Because, full disclosure, I work in the foreign exchange markets, and China fixes its currency, they intervene, their reserve figures are unreliable. So how does that factor in?
I guess I'll take that one. So there's an interesting interaction, but I don't think it's a given. So during Bretton Woods, there was this idea that the problem with Bretton Woods and the dollar were due to the fixed exchange. So it was a balance of payments problem. Now that turned out to be wrong to the first order in the sense that once we moved to floating exchange rate, this hasn't gone away. In fact, we're still talking about it today. Why? Because the rigidity is the promise that the US made to the rest of the world that if you buy a treasury, you will find that it has a high payoff, relatively speaking, in bad states of the world. That's a commitment that we make, that we will not pursue monetary and fiscal policies or default policies such as during the 2008 crisis, we would have massively depreciated or defaulted. That's really where the problem is. And so ultimately, it's a fiscal problem. The balance of payments, which is whether or not you fix the exchange rate, interacts with it. And so similarly with China, there is a tendency to focus on the net, whether they're borrowing or lending to the rest of the world. But really, this is about the gross position. Is you could let the foreigners buy half of the treasury market of China, and China could reinvest that money abroad and still manage a lot of the exchange rate. It's about the free movement of capital in gross flows, and the net is part of it. So it's not irrelevant, but it's not a given. There's a lot that you can do with both. Similarly, if you have a very unstable currency, the fact that it's floating doesn't make it pretty for the rest of the world to hold. And so it's an interesting interaction, but it's not as straightforward as is one or the other.
Okay. Well, there was that gentleman, and then Anat immediately afterwards.
Thank you, and a wonderful panel. Thank you for the discussion. The question I had was with respect to the concept of complacency, right? So some of the perspectives I heard is that, yeah, US dollar is not going anywhere, and that's great. I am happy about that. But from a complacency point of view, what about some of these deals, side deals that are happening, like barter exchange between big growing population countries? Some of that, as it increases, how do you think of that? Because that's happening outside the dollar system. Even though it's small right now, it may be having a fast growth rate with the geopolitical tensions and stuff like that. And then, as we discussed, there was a gold standard. Things keep on changing every N number of years. So is dollar forever, or what does the crystal ball say about what's the vision around what else could happen other than the dollar, very long term?
Would one of you like to address either of the parts of that question?
So I think that I'm not too concerned about the fact that, for instance, Saudi Arabia and China have agreed to invoice oil sales between them in RMB. I think it could have, whichever reserve banks are facilitating that exchange may, on the margin, modify their reserve holdings so that they've got additional RMB. But I still come back to I don't see anybody else in the world going to prefer to have their oil invoiced in RMB rather than dollars because of the capital controls, if for no other reason. It doesn't facilitate being a good means of exchange. Clearly, China could, if it wanted, through Belt and Road, try to encourage more of the countries that it's doing some of its development with to move to RMB invoicing. But then you come back to, what does China benefit from that? So if we're questioning whether the US benefits from being the reserve currency, I don't know how much China would want to condition any of its international development activity on the companies in that country invoicing in RMB. So that piece, I'm less concerned by what's coming out of the oil piece. It's if other countries were to want to have their oil purchases invoiced in non-dollars that I would start to raise some concerns.
As a point of fact, it happened last week that China invoiced for 1 million barrels of oil in ECNY, their new central bank digital currency, which is RMB. But it seems like it was for show rather than a legitimate way to grow internationalization of the RMB or do a reserve currency boost.
Yeah, I could just clarify one thing that came out that I think deserves kind of underlying is that the RMB would have to be used in relations outside of Chinese trade in order to be internationalized.
Right.
Mark, I'll do a nod and then come back to you.
I want to pick up on a couple of things related to technology. So one is the CBDC and the other is sort of crypto and other currencies. So it's more clarification, but I thought crypto kind of took care of itself as a currency, namely we're less optimistic about privately issued crypto, let's say. We do understand the concept of central bank money, but when it comes to CBDC, I just wonder, what do you actually mean that we need to go there? Do you mean, most transactions are digital anyway, so it's the presence of the cash behind it is kind of, how important is that? So I wonder what you mean when you say CBDC. Do you mean that the central bank will start, having accounts for everybody, or what is it that you mean?
So my understanding, there's two different versions. There's institutional CBDCs and then there's retail. Within retail, you have intermediated and then you have the direct on deposit with the Federal Reserve. Again, I don't see all that much of an issue with going to the wholesale. It seems to me that they're going to look a lot like reserve assets right now, excess reserves. So then if you move to retail, I think you get to the privacy concerns, and so then the question is, what are the benefits of having this intermediated piece? Is that a substitute, for instance, for deposit insurance? What is that? And then dealing with the privacy issues. So those are the three categories that are potentially out there right now. Where's the benefit? The benefit that people assert, and again, I'm not advocating in favor of a retail CBDC, those advocating in favor of it, generally my understanding is it potentially eliminates the need for deposit insurance, and also it potentially improves financial inclusion by lowering costs of accessing the banking system. Those are what I understand to be the arguments in favor of it, but I'm not an advocate of it.
Mark has a question, and then there's a question back here.
Okay, great. I want to thank all of the panelists because each winter I teach Econ 1 and I have to cover macro there. So I'm trying to be going back to this session and learning a lot. This is like sort of out of my strike zone. But I remember 25-ish years ago when I was a grad student, my advisor, Marty Feldstein, I want to see if you think this is an issue, talked a lot about the U.S. net international investment position and the vulnerability that created. Now, at that time, when I was a graduate student, he flagged that he was troubled and that the U.S. investors owned $1.5 trillion less of foreign assets than foreigners owned of U.S. assets. And we've talked about public debt here today, government debt and so forth. But today, the corresponding, and he said that was very problematic because foreigners weren't going to be willing to lend to the U.S. indefinitely. The dollar would inevitably have to come down, that was going to create pressure for the dollar. Today, that $1.5 trillion is $17 trillion. Now, I get there's been inflation, but it hasn't been over tenfold. So I'm just wondering, is that number, that 17 trillion, a sign of like the dollar is a sign of dollar dominance? Or is it a threat to dollar dominance? As me being my limited applied micro, I'm just trying to wrap my head around all this stuff. Thanks.
Sounds like you, Matteo.
Yeah, so it's both. So let me phrase it this way: the U.S. is just that economists are so good at this. So think of it as the U.S. is a large bank, and the bank has gotten bigger. Now, that tells you two things. It tells you that the business model is viable, the depositors are there, the assets are there. It also tells you that if we go down, it's a bigger run. Now, that's a statement of a fact. Now, the question is, does it tell us anything about the probability of a run? And probably not. One, we're horrible at predicting them. Two, I think that's much more to do with the composition, like how many of these assets are long-term, illiquid, how many are short-term and liquid. I think on that, very reasonable people will have very different views. But the fact that the bank has gotten bigger, it's definitely true. The major shift in thinking from the few years ago when you were a graduate student, has really been about the importance of the gross. So we used to keep over-focus on the net, which is the current account. And now we focus much more on gross assets and liabilities, very much like we would for a bank, because we've come to an understanding that, one, they're much bigger, they're an order of magnitude bigger than the net, but two, that their composition isn't identical. Roughly speaking, at least until in recent years, the US has a lot of dollar liquid liabilities and a bunch of equities. It's not always true, and it's changed a lot in the last 10 years. But you would, like for a bank, you wouldn't take the assets and the liabilities, net them out, and say, I only need to care about the net. You would actually carefully inspect what's on either side of the balance sheet. That's really where we moved in the last 20 years, since the focus was originally very much on the net. But I don't think we are, it's just a large bank. And
So you're not worried, 17 trillion, I shouldn't be worried.
not per se, I'm worried like I am of any large financial institution.
This gentleman right here has been waiting. Thank you.
Oh, can you hear me? It was a pretty quick question, but if you take the debt chart, which we all love, and you roll it out 30 years, if that actually happens, what happens? What's life like in that kind of a world? What happens to interest payments? How does it? Are there 2 or 3 scenarios that result?
And you're asking about the fiscal implications for the United States as
Correct.
opposed to the dollar dominance question.
Well, actually, I would ask it from a global perspective in terms of.
Okay. Anyone want to handle what are the implications?
I would just say the reason that we changed that section of the financial report of the U.S. government to be called an unsustainable fiscal path is because were we to actually do nothing and go down that path, it's something we can't model. That amount of debt outstanding, the interest rate that would be, that models would suggest just aren't. We can't afford, the debt service costs that are associated with it. You end up into a debt spiral, and so. The question is, how do we sooner rather than later get the American people to recognize that we need to make fundamental shifts in the unfunded liabilities that we have and incur a little bit of pain now so that we don't have to incur the situation you described?
But Japan and Italy have gone there. They're still alive. Matteo, any view?
Well, the US is not going to get Germany to support them. Italy found a solution. It's called the German fiscal.
The projection of doing nothing is 550% of GDP 75 years from now. That's not where Japan is.
Good. Peter, I think you have a question.
So, I guess it's a question for Matteo, but the idea or the analogy of the U.S. as a super bank, I think, brings up the question of financial regulation. And right now, that's not been a topic introduced to this discussion, so I want to introduce it and ask you about, as you see U.S. bank regulators address U.S. bank issues, are they missing any important considerations as it relates to the U.S. as a super bank and dollar dominance? And could they fix one thing over here but miss the forest for the trees on this super big issue of dollar stability? I know Daryl's written a little about this, or a lot about this with the Treasury market, but I was curious if you have any concerns.
It's a great question. So there's been a fair amount of progress in this, particularly with the global financial crisis. There's been a deep recognition that who owns what, whether they're levered, it's not of micro interest, it's of macro interest, because when that crisis comes, is all that matters. And so there's been a fair amount of macroprudential policy that has been introduced since. There is also a recognition that precisely because of the centrality of the dollar, the US has a number of extra duties. You've seen it with the Fed swap lines during the 2008 crisis. Where there's still progress to be made is on non-bank financial intermediation. So US mutual funds and foreign mutual funds are a bigger and bigger component of the data. There's reasons to believe that they're much safer than banks because they're equity finance in some sense. But I'm making it a bit too easy. There's plenty out there that we would like to know more about, in particular on the liquidity of the security. I can think of like the corporate bond mutual funds. There is also the sovereign wealth funds. A large part of the data now has state actors as the investors. And how they're going to behave in crisis as they become very big, it's going to be interesting because we're going to have a very granular set of lenders. And a few large players are becoming quite important in both the private sector and the public sector. That's not something that we've done a lot of thinking about collectively. I suspect that the academic research, at least in the next 10 years, is going to focus a fair amount on that.
Any last word on this point? Nope. I see Mark standing up. That's our sign. Thank you very much. What a terrific panel.